maybe his last kick of a ball for Chelsea Football Club. Buries it! Chelsea win the Champions League!
It was Chelsea's holy grail. It was the one thing Roman Abramovich had not delivered to Stamford Bridge in his cash-filled 9 years of ownership. And yet they did it when they were at their absolute weakest. This is how Chelsea's Champions League was finally won. When Jose Mourinho was fired, mutually consented, left in a strop delete as appropriate to your allegiances, Chelsea were plunged into a sea of unknown. Yes, they'd had the support of Roman Abramovich for a year before Mourinho, and they'd reached the final four of the Champions League, but they'd not felt such success as they had felt under the Portuguese manager. And then, to make matters seemingly worse, an unknown by the name of Avram Grant was hired as the new manager.
It's called nepotism, David.
How a man who previously had only managed in Israel had become technical director in the summer of 2007. It was a strange move then, but was instantly obvious as an exercise in squeezing out Mourinho as the club's main man. It didn't look written in the stars that Chelsea and Abramovich's holy grail should have been won anytime soon then. By May 2008, it was very much written in the stars. They'd finally beaten Liverpool after 6 attempts in the Champions League. The final was in Moscow, and after missing out on the Premier League to Manchester United, the same opponents revealed themselves in Abramovich's home country. All written in the stars. Until...
to win the Champions League for Chelsea. And it's a chop, and he's not happy now.
Jose Mourinho couldn't get Chelsea to the Champions League final, but Avram Grant could. How on earth does that work? Well, enter Steve Clarke, who earned himself a promotion from first-team coach to assistant to Avram Grant. The well-trusted Chelsea man, combined with a strong core of player from Petr Cech and John Terry on the back line to Frank Lampard and Didier Drogba further afield, the club were well stocked, so they could run almost without a manager. How very Chelsea of them. Also, Avram Grant was gone because why not, and in his place the club effectively derailed Portugal's Euro 2008 campaign by announcing their manager as the Avram Grant successor. The new man, Big Phil Scolari, the scourge of the England national team over the course of the last 3 major international tournaments, it stood to reason that he could be the scourge to Chelsea's English opponents too. He wouldn't make it to the knockouts of the Champions League, sacked whilst occupying 4th place after a limp draw to Hull City. Mid-season and faltering with Europe fast approaching on the horizon, Abramovich did what he did best, tapped into his endless resources and hired the Russia national team manager. Thankfully at this time the Russian national team manager was Gus Hiddink. He got Chelsea into a top 4 position, won them a cup, and it was only dark outside forces that stopped Chelsea from appearing in another Champions League semi-final.
Lampard looking to pull it back, and Essien!
Yeah, he's impeded him, he's given the free kick to Chelsea.
Referee says no! Messi, it's Iniesta! Ballack has a rattle, a handball appeal.
And Norway is the strongest official you can put down. This is supposed to be...
In a move very un-Abramovich-like, he wanted to keep his manager, but this time he was thwarted by Hiddink's word to his contract back in Moscow. No bother, there was a decent manager on the market and he went by the name of Carlo Ancelotti. Arguably Chelsea's peak stylistically on the pitch, even now in 2025, came in Ancelotti's first campaign. The league won, the FA Cup won, the Champions League, well, a former flame and misfortune in the draw did for them in that one.
From Inter Milan's leading goal scorer, Diego Milito. Cambiasso, and again!
Brilliant finish from Eto'o.
The style of football, the domestic records, none of it mattered. Abramovich had to suffer through finishing only 2nd and not winning any silverware in England in 2011. He also had to suffer through one of the weakest Champions League campaigns by his Chelsea team yet.
Lovely angle, Giggs! Now Giggs, and it's Jason Park in space!
Through the endless oscillations of managers, Chelsea had finally realised their mediocrity in Europe, where once there were finals and semi-finals, no matter who the manager was, a special one or an unknown one, now not even Carlo Ancelotti could muster up a spot in the latter stages. Then Chelsea did Chelsea things and sacked Ancelotti. A weaker squad and now no manager the 2011-12 season looked all set to be an unmitigated disaster. The Chelsea way since Abramovich beached in West London was to hire the best in class, on the pitch and off it. The lineage had been Mourinho, Scolari, Hiddink and Ancelotti. Yeah, just forget about Avram. So in the summer of 2011, they did something against the grain, but of course it involved throwing money at the situation. Andre Villas-Boas was hired as the new Chelsea manager, ahead of names like Marco van Basten, Didier Deschamps and Harry Redknapp. What? That had previously been touted. Instead, the manager role of one of England's biggest clubs had been entrusted with a 33-year-old with 2 years' experience in the job. He got his foot in the door as an even fresher-faced 16-year-old when he bashed the door down of the manager of his local football team, FC Porto's Bobby Robson. He sufficiently impressed him with his advisory notes on tactics, team selection and performance that the manager hired him and sent him off to Scotland to earn his UEFA qualifications, presumably for a bit of peace and quiet. Instead, Villas-Boas returned, banged out his C, B, A and Pro licences by the age of 21, at which point he swanned off to work for the British Virgin Islands national team in the Caribbean. A great gig in the sunshine if you can get it, but his hunger drove him back to Europe and back to Porto, where by this point they had another legendary manager in charge who trusted him, a certain Jose Mourinho. He followed his compatriot to Chelsea and subsequently to Inter Milan, becoming Mourinho's eyes and ears. Until that relationship was broken in the early stages of 2009 when Villas-Boas officially became AVB. He stepped out there on his own, managing Académica in the lower reaches of the Primeira Liga back home in Portugal. His shepherding of the seemingly doomed club to mid-table earned the attention of his hometown club, FC Porto. They had just won the double, their manager had chipped over the border to Malaga, and then AVB went one better, not only winning the Liga and the Taça de Portugal, but the Europa League. And not only did they win the Liga, they dropped just 6 points in the entire season, going undefeated. Such is the food chain of football, the Premier League strong-armed their way in and revealed their desire to have AVB, another homecoming to Chelsea. Enormous news, but perhaps even bigger news that sneaked about in the tall grass of the thick and fast Chelsea news cycle. Club legend Roberto Di Matteo was hired as his assistant manager. We'd be hearing a lot from him in the not too distant future. A man who had been dripping in Chelsea silverware in days even before Roman Abramovich had even heard of Chelsea Football Club. Despite his lack of experience, Di Matteo was the one who knew the club. His boss was the one with seemingly the brightest future in football management. A match made in heaven, apparently. Chelsea's activity on the player market effectively mirrored their activity on the managerial market, an attempt to freshen things up in what was an ageing squad. Thibaut Courtois was in from Genk and immediately shipped off to Atletico Madrid on loan, and he was the starting goalkeeper for the future when Petr Cech eventually left. Oriol Romeo of Barcelona was intended to be an option of the same vein as a Makelele or Mikel, but again for the future. Meanwhile, Romelu Lukaku was brought in from Anderlecht with the same idea in mind. Once January arrived, players like Patrick Bamford and Kevin De Bruyne were acquired with the same thinking, by which point the mood and the entire project had soured a little bit. The win now signings though had pulled through for the club. Valencia's Juan Mata was well on course to win the club's Player of the Year award, whilst Liverpool's Raul Meireles had performed admirably in what was supposed to be a bit part deadline day splurge. He was effectively the backup plan after the first choice of Luka Modric fell through as a stubborn Daniel Levy got his way and the Croatian would eventually depart White Hart Lane for a superpower outside the league in Real Madrid. Chelsea's position as one of those superpowers hadn't barred them from a tricky-looking Champions League group as they were drawn both Bayer Leverkusen and Valencia. The campaign was penciled in to start on September the 13th when all was still rosy in the Stamford Bridge garden. AVB had presided over a 4-match unbeaten run in the league, much like their title rivals from Manchester, and he'd got on his backline in place. Didier Drogba was still missing from the front line due to injury as the manager cycled through the litany of his options, opting for 2 of Anelka, Sturridge or Torres. And that unbeaten streak continued into Europe.
Luiz's shot! Make it 2-0. Great chance for Fernando Torres, unselfishly squares it.
Everything was good, even if the drop-in of Frank Lampard for a more solid midfield two of Morelos and Mikel was beginning to rankle with both supporters and player. And whilst Fernando Torres showcased one of the worst misses in football history in the club's first loss of the season up at Old Trafford and Valencia stole a point at the Mestalla, the Blues were beginning to fire on all cylinders. 4 past Swansea, 5 swept beyond Bolton away from home before a comfortable home triumph for Everton followed. Genk, meanwhile, would be no match in Europe.
Worth a crack, and has it. Oh, it's good. Here's Torres, he's in. Great first touch. Oh! Morelos, a wonderful ball in for Torres. He's got. Malouda's ball in to Ivanovic. It's 4. And the cross this time is brilliant, and so is the save. There's the follow-up.
Frank Lampard had stamped his authority with a hat-trick up at Bolton, was given the captain's armband back for the visit of Genk, but this would be a battle that would come to define AVB's time in the Stamford Bridge hot seat. Fine in the heady days of August, September and October, less so when AVB's tenure and potentially season spun on a single visit to Loftus Road on October the 23rd. Discipline had abandoned the club. Didier Drogba and Jose Bosingua earned red cards. QPR took the lead and subsequent 3 points before John Terry's racial abuse of Anton Ferdinand was reported. The FA would eventually find the Chelsea captain guilty, subject him to a ban and a hefty fine while stripping him of the captaincy and derailing the Fabio Capello England tenure. Meanwhile, criminal proceedings, it has to be said, found Terry not guilty. Then results fell off a cliff. Chelsea shipped 5 at home to Arsenal before suffering another home defeat to Liverpool. Meanwhile, the club's Champions League status was somehow now hanging by a thread.
Louise, saved. Easily done. Camus with the cutback. Great chance at Genk level. Chance here, checks out. And it must be, it is. It's Castro's corner. Good delivery, and it's in.
Valencia were the next visitors to Stamford Bridge, and Chelsea led the Spaniards only on their head-to-head record and by the slimmest of margins. As Leverkusen visited Belgium with an expected 3 points soon to bolster their position at the top of the group, Chelsea's mission was similarly easy. A win or goalless draw would do it. Their league form had returned, comfortable 3-0 wins over both Wolves and Newcastle, even if another home defeat had been suffered in a League Cup exit against Liverpool. But that was the League Cup, that wasn't the Holy Grail Abramovich sought desperately after. That item, of course, the Champions League trophy. Another 3-0 win, as recently seen in the league, would be lovely.
Now Drogba, not much room to shoot, but he found it! Trying to play in Ramirez, who's got to it first, and scored! Stay on side, he's managed it, 3-0, that's it! Chelsea in the last 16.
Champions League qualification assured, perhaps the single most important result came from the Cristal Arena as Die Smurfen, yes that means the Smurfs, and that's one of Genk's nicknames allegedly, held Bayer Leverkusen to a draw. An important result on the surface. Chelsea moved to top spot in the group whilst Leverkusen were open to a stern last 16 test as group runners-up. When the draw was made later that week, the result was even more important. It was Barcelona awaiting Bayer Leverkusen whilst Chelsea drew Napoli. The Italians were comfortably one of the stronger runners-up in a field containing Basel, CSKA Moscow and Zenit St. Petersburg, but they were an infinitely easier task than what many were in agreement of as the best club team football has ever seen. 77 days separated Chelsea's qualification into the knockouts and their first leg in Naples. There was no confirmation that André Villas-Boas would be the manager by then. Roman Abramovich's patience was already being tested by what was incessantly called a project at Chelsea. Usually the project at Chelsea was to win trophies instantly and by the bucket load, and if you weren't capable of that, you were handed your P45. Villas-Boas was able to squeak through in the earlier rounds of the FA Cup. He was allowed to preside over the sale of Nicola Anelka and the replacement of the departing Alex in Bolton's Gary Cahill. But the mood was worsening amid a faltering league campaign that took in a trio of 1-1 Christmas-time draws and an embarrassing home defeat to Aston Villa. AVB hadn't been beaten in the league as a football manager for 17 months. In the space of a half of a Premier League season, he'd been bested 5 times. The discipline had gone, he'd lost the dressing room by continuing to drop the 33-year-old Frank Lampard, and the manager had been accused of losing his head after he initiated the sacking of Chelsea TV pundit and former player Tommy Langley for his opinions aired on an in-house broadcast. And this was supposed to be a honeymoon period topped up with the reprieve of results in Europe. After Christmas though, Chelsea's league form did not change. By 3 more draws as January became February, including a 3-goal capitulation at home to Manchester United, the Blues' Champions League participation was threatened. Forget the league, that was a distant memory. And what's worse, after Chelsea's first ever 3-goal Premier League capitulation, the team was paid a dreaded training ground visit from Roman Abramovich. Days were officially numbered. A combination of a Goodison Park defeat and a limp 5th round draw against Championship outfit Birmingham City in the Cup was hardly the best preparation in the world for the return of the Champions League. The Blues now needed a miracle in Naples.
Betsy! Useful ball, and it's 2-1. He's out of his goal. Should be 3-1, is 3-1. Marek Hamšík, Cavani, Maggio off the line.
The only positive was the return of Michael Essien, as well as the acquisition of Gary Cahill. Mere days before the visit of Napoli, the club was plunged into shambles once again. A defeat up at the Hawthorns was the last straw for Roman Abramovich. Andre Villas-Boas was gone. The interim Roberto Di Matteo earned his promotion and returned the cliched feel-good factor in small doses, toiling to the FA Cup quarter-final away against Birmingham City before earning 3 points from his first league game at home to Stoke. The performances were hardly groundbreaking, but the results helped massively. With that triumph over Stoke, Chelsea had temporarily gone level on points with Arsenal and only 10 matches were left to play in the league. It wasn't beyond the realms of possibility that Chelsea could squeak back into the top 4. And speaking of Champions Leagues and results, Napoli pitched up at Stamford Bridge next. Only a result mattered and Chelsea needed to overturn a 2-goal deficit. It was a night for the ages and one that changed the club's entire history.
How's the cross? Oh, it's brilliant towards Drogba! Corner! It's in there! Dropping for Inlet! It's in! And Pod! It's 3-1! All through to Drogba. Oh! Ivanovic!
Chelsea was still alive, a club legend was in charge, and there was still a possibility of a Champions League, FA Cup and Champions League qualification treble. It didn't matter, especially on the evening of March 14th, 2012, that it seemed incredibly remote. Stamford Bridge was rocking again. Even more so when the European draw was made. Alright, Chelsea hadn't been drawn the Cypriot minnows of APOEL or the other appealing draw in Marseille, but they had avoided the terrifying beasts of Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Barcelona or the Italian champions Milan. In Benfica, Chelsea would meet a winnable but dangerous opponent. But the Blues couldn't put off the elite of Europe forever. Pep Guardiola's Barcelona, the likely semi-final opponents. Club form deserted Di Matteo for the time being. Manchester City handed them league revenge and their Champions League rivals Spurs held them to a stalemate at the Bridge. But another championship team were vanquished in the Cup, this time in a more satisfying 5-star 5-goal performance against Leicester. Now it was time for Europe and Benfica. And whilst Napoli were an exciting, if flawed and inexperienced side, Benfica were experienced, they were functional and they had the history.
He's round the back here, Fernando Torres. Chance here for Chelsea, they scored!
Big moment in this tie, and Lampard buries it. That's the corner, it's in! It's still Morelos, this to finish it! Oh, he's buried it!
Chelsea had recorded their first European away win in 13 months and it had been scarily comfortable, but those days in Europe were definitively over. Typically, it was Barcelona awaiting Chelsea in the semis. A good job that the Blues returned to domestic football undefeated, albeit only picking up 4 points from matches against Wigan and Fulham. Nonetheless, they hung on in there for a 4th place finish and were still competing on 3 fronts. An FA Cup semi-final 3 days out from a club-defining European semi against the best football team the sport had ever seen, especially for such an inconsistent squad, should have been a nightmare. But then Chelsea peeled back the Wembley curtains and realised, it's only Tottenham, lads. The 5-1 win would hand Chelsea the world of confidence heading into a rowdy first leg against Barca at the Bridge. You know all the names on the pitch, you know who the scalp belonged to on the sidelines. Chelsea were minnows in comparison.
Got the pace, has he got the finish? Oh, it's a great chance for Drogba! Oh, ho, ho! Up off the ground, in the back of the
Euphoria. Chelsea had won the first leg of a Champions League semi-final once before, back in 2007. This time though, the Blues wouldn't have the same cauldron of Anfield in the second leg, and after the debacle of 2009 against this same Pep Guardiola and this same Barcelona, Chelsea wouldn't have to worry about Tom Henning of Vrebo. Chelsea tiptoed through a goalless draw against Arsenal in the league, and whilst 4 points was the difference between the club and assuring Champions League qualification, they came through the contest unscathed. Next, Barcelona, the new camp and Chelsea's biggest game in 4 years.
Alves on the ball, they're much more dangerous. It's a red card. Messi, this is looking dangerous. Onside, it's two. Get one. No flag against Ramirez. Oh! Never scored against Chelsea before, and he hasn't now either.
Most dramatic story of the season. It's Torres to give Chelsea a place in the Champions League final. The headline has been written.
Unbelievable! Backs against the wall, more than a whiff of a certain Jose Mourinho performance at the same stage of the same competition 2 years prior. He'd have been proud. History was made now for the small matter of Bayern Munich in Chelsea's second ever Champions League final. A club that was faltering behind giants in their own division in Jurgen Klopp's Borussia Dortmund. The big asterisk was the fact that this final would be played on away soil. Bayern in Munich and Chelsea were one night away from European glory again. If any other pressure was needed to be piled on what was a rollercoaster season, May Premier League defeats at home to Newcastle United and at Anfield consigned the club to 6th place come the end of the campaign. This version of Chelsea, no matter how imperfect they had been, had shown their resilience for the grand occasions on the continent, and what's more, via the medium of the FA Cup final against Liverpool, they had got a trophy under their belt thanks to winners on either end of the pitch. First, the customary Didier Drogba goal at Wembley, then the generational save from Petr Cech, both match-winning in their own right. Therefore, the club rode to Munich on a wave of delirium to a stadium that screamed that this was Bayern's occasion. The banners roared that this was their city, their club, their competition and their trophy. And whilst Chelsea were missing John Terry, Branislav Ivanovic, Ramirez and Raul Meireles, Bayern had their own glut of suspensions. And yet it was Bayern that could field names that just trip off the tongue. Neuer, Lahm, Boateng, Schweinsteiger, Kroos, Robben, Muller, Ribéry. Chelsea meanwhile had the inexperienced defensive partnership of David Luiz and Gary Cahill. They had only one sitting midfielder in John Obi Mikel, and they had a left back playing left midfield in Ryan Bertrand that was making his European debut. There appeared only one winner in a season where Chelsea was seemingly trying their hardest to appear like losers. But Chelsea were formed in 1905. The match will be played on the 19th day of the 5th month, 1905, so at least they had that. They also had the fact that Munich was also a good omen for them. The city had hosted the Champions League or European Cup final 3 times previously. 1979 when Nottingham Forest won it, 1993 when Marseille won it, 1997 when Borussia Dortmund won it. One thing in common, all first-time winners, and Chelsea had yet to win the trophy. It was the technical, the material and the realistic versus the outside chance of the mystical Bayern Munich versus Chelsea.
Dangerous ball in, Muller's there again and he scored! 2 and a bit left. Matters corner, Drogba! Robben for Bayern. Kept out by Cech! Cech. Here's Mata. Come on, Big Pete. Mario Gomez. Neuer. Lampard smash. Olic saved by Cech. Up he steps. Oh, he's in the post. Didier Drogba with maybe his last kick of a ball for Chelsea Football Club. Buries it! Chelsea win the Champions League! The name's on the trophy now, all right.
The Holy Grail had been won by the seat of their pants. Chelsea were European champions and they did it in the most Chelsea way imaginable. They sacked a manager, limped to Munich, home of their final opponents with suspensions and injury, and won the biggest prize in football. What happened next was entirely Chelsea as well. Of course, Chelsea sacked their European champion winning coach, Roberto Di Matteo, before 2012 was over, and, in the most part, it didn't matter in the absolute slightest. They were able to hire Rafael Benitez, once their sparring partner, and ultimately that sentiment remained around the club despite the semi-finals, the finals, and a Europa League achieved in 2013. And by the summer, the club went crawling back to Jose Mourinho, where, naturally, he got the club back into the Champions League conversation but wasn't able to win it before being prolific in the League Cup as well as grabbing Chelsea a 5th English League title. This is what Chelsea were now. They weren't the happy-go-lucky team tiptoeing out into Europe with a hatful of dreams like they were in the 70s. They weren't the cosmopolitan outlier in a sea of Premier League 4-4-2 in the 90s. They were now European champions, and they simply had to do it in the Chelsea way, which was not just throwing money at the situation, but remaining bulletproof through bad performances and a whirling dervish of managerial changes and sticking to their core players. Petr Cech, John Terry, Frank Lampard, Didier Drogba, they all presided over the Mourinho peak in the mid-2000s. They were older, wiser, a bit creakier, with one in their full kit when he probably shouldn't have been. It simply had to be done without AVB. The job was way too big, the personalities at the club, both on and off the pitch, way too much, and it all came ridiculously too soon for the young Portuguese manager. Being a project manager, he attempted to change too much, pissed off far too many club stalwarts, and ultimately failed. Roberto Di Matteo had undergone a meteoric rise of his own. Whilst AVB was allegedly the next big thing and courted from a young age, Di Matteo had taken another route, defeating Barcelona 3 years to the day that his MK Dons side had lost 1-0 to the mighty Walsall in a League One game. Sometimes club legend vibes win out in the short term, and for Chelsea's ultimate glory, the method fit like hand in glove. And what's even funnier is that they ripped a rare Spurs chance at playing in the Champions League whilst completing this glory. Of course, the Di Matteo-Chelsea arrangement would only be temporary, but now Jose Mourinho was back. The club should have been revitalised, and if you missed his first go at the Stamford Bridge job, go and watch this.